Hello and welcome to Unacademy, a one stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good morning and welcome to the most comprehensive Hindu analysis on YouTube. So let's begin our discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. From the Delhi edition of the Hindu, I have chosen 10 important articles for a detailed and comprehensive analysis. The idea is to ensure that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. If you guys are liking this initiative, do support us with your likes, your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Now, before we start, I have a very important announcement. Those of you who are preparing for 2026 and beyond, you have an opportunity to enroll for our online classroom program at just 17,999, which is a discounted price on our online classes. This subscription will give you access to all the live and recorded lectures, along with the study material, the test series, and as well as the mentorship and doubt resolution sessions. Now, if you avail the offer before 19th July, the offer is ending on 19th July, and you will stand a chance to get up to 12 months of free extension. So, in order to avail this offer, you need to enter the code IAS English. On the subscription page, you might see a different price, but if you enter the code IAS English, this offer will become applicable. So, those interested, do ensure you enroll before 19th of July, and the link is provided in the video description below. And if you want the PDF of this session, please join my Telegram channel by scanning the QR code on your screen. After the session ends, I'll be sharing the PDF over here. So, with this, let's get started and look at the first article. The first article from page number 6 is related to disaster management. The article is written by an expert in the field of dealing with disasters. And the focus of the article is India's preparedness with regard to earthquakes. Recently, I'm sure many of you would have read about it, or at least you might have experienced it as well if you're in Delhi. Just a few days ago, Delhi witnessed a low intensity earthquake. It was registered at 4.4 on the Richter scale by the National Center for Seismology, and it caused mild tremors in the national capital and in the region around it. So, these mild tremors are a recurrent feature across the Indo-Gangetic Plain and the Himalayan belt. But the writer is presenting a stark warning that any time there might be a mega earthquake in the Indian subcontinent. And for such a disaster, India is grossly unprepared. Because you might have seen that in the last 3 to 4 months, tectonic activity and seismic activity in general has gone up, especially across Asia. We saw the deadly earthquake a few months ago in Myanmar and Thailand. We have seen repeated tremors from Taiwan to Japan. We have seen recent incidents even as far away as Greece. And across the region, the increasing seismic activity represents a rising concern, especially for a country like India, which is highly prone to the impact of earthquakes. So, in this context, the writer is evaluating, is India prepared to deal with such a mega disaster? If not tomorrow, sometime in the near future, there is likely to be a devastating earthquake in the Indian subcontinent. In the past as well, we have seen many such tragic incidents, and India has often paid a very heavy price. For example, if you remember the Bhuj earthquake, more than 20,000 people were killed. There was large scale destruction of property and infrastructure, and the region suffered a major setback following the devastating earthquake. And who doesn't remember the 2004 underwater earthquake along the fault line at Sumatra in Indonesia, which unleashed the deadly Indian Ocean tsunami that caused massive damage across multiple Indian Ocean countries, especially the coastline of Tamil Nadu, Andaman Nicobar Islands, were devastated by this deadly tsunami that was unleashed by an underwater earthquake that occurred at Sumatra. So these are warning bells that India should listen to. That's what the writer is trying to highlight. Because Indian cities, especially in highly seismic zones, they are grossly unprepared to deal with even a medium magnitude disaster. Forget a high magnitude earthquake, even a reasonably sized earthquake could bring large scale devastation across the highly seismic zones in our country. Now, to understand this further, we first need to evaluate the hazard. What is the risk associated with earthquakes? What kind of damage and destruction can be seen? And which parts of India are more prone and vulnerable? We need to examine the hazard and vulnerability map of India. Now, if you look at earthquakes, the primary damage occurs because of falling buildings and any establishment which we have constructed on the surface of the earth. The trembling that is introduced in the earth's crust by the release of massive energy during this seismic event, it ends up destabilizing the foundation of all the buildings that we have constructed. And that covers not just private property, it covers critical infrastructure as well. So, from power plants to roads, railway lines, and the entire infrastructure in a city or in a given region could be completely brought down by these devastating earthquakes. Now, if you look at India's hazard and vulnerability map, which is brought out by the National Disaster Management Authority, you can see here that a large part of India lies in zone 5 and zone 4, indicating extreme high risk because of seismic activity. As the Indian plate subducts under the Eurasian plate in a north northeast direction, as it keeps moving and diving around 4 to 5 centimeters every year and pushing the Himalayas upwards. This entire fault line from the Hindu Kush mountains near Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way till the China Myanmar border. This whole stretch of the Himalayan belt and the lower Himalayas and the Indo Gangetic plain around it is extremely vulnerable for high intensity earthquakes. So, be it Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and the entire Terai plains of Nepal, UP, and Bihar, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Arunachal Pradesh, and the regions surrounding it, from across West Bengal to UP, Bihar, Delhi, NCR region. So the writer is focused on our national capital and how the population here, the infrastructure around this region is extremely vulnerable to the impact of high intensity earthquakes. Most geologists agree that a mega earthquake is due in the Himalayan belt anytime. And if you look at the preparedness of the region, we are grossly unprepared because, according to the writer, in the city of Delhi and the NCR region alone, 80% of the buildings are not earthquake proof. They are not resilient to withstand the impact of earthquakes. See, most of the impact of earthquakes can be minimized, it can be mitigated if urban construction is earthquake friendly, if buildings are designed to be resilient to withstand the impact. Now, if you saw the recent earthquake that hit Myanmar and as well as Thailand, there was a stark difference in the damage that was suffered. In a country like Myanmar, where there is no stable government, no enforcement of building codes, there was large scale wipeout of buildings, resulting in very high death count. Large scale injuries were reported. Large scale destruction of infrastructure was reported in Myanmar. But you did not see the same extent of damage in Thailand, especially in crowded cities like Bangkok. Because in recent years, Bangkok had upgraded its city urban standards, strictly enforced some of the building codes, and even some of the older buildings were retrofitted with earthquake resilient and resistant design, which helped most of the buildings withstand the impact and thus it minimized the damage. Now, if you compare a city like Bangkok with that of Delhi, Delhi has a population of more than 3 crores if you take the entire NCR region into account. In such a crowded, populated city, which is densely populated, packed with buildings, 80% of the buildings do not have earthquake safe design incorporated, especially those buildings constructed prior to the year 2000. None of them follow the standard codes which are implemented. It's not that India doesn't have regulations. India does have sufficient regulations. Under the disaster management plan and policy, the center, the state, and the local administration, they are responsible for not only codifying these standards, but implementing those standards as well. The local city corporations, the municipal bodies, are responsible for the building bylaws, which should align with the standards that are laid down by the Bureau of Indian Standards. The BIS has worked with the National Disaster Management Authority to bring out a standard building code based on the seismic zones for the various seismic zones across the country. Appropriate building codes and standards have been prescribed by the BIS, which is supposed to be enforced by the local city corporations. And this is where India is found to be lacking. The enforcement is missing. It's not just Delhi NCR. You look at states like Sikkim, Himachal Pradesh, and Uttarakhand. Look at Northeast India, especially states like Manipur, Mizoram, Nagaland. They are sitting on zone 5. Same with Andaman Nicobar Islands, the Bhuj region in the Kutch Peninsula of Gujarat. These areas are in zone 5 and zone 4, and yet the building standards have not been implemented. Even some of the critical infrastructure, the older projects that were built in these zones, they are not earthquake resilient. So, this is the biggest risk that the writer is trying to flag. Data from the National Center for Seismology, which is under the Ministry of Earth Sciences, it shows that there are recurring low magnitude earthquakes occurring on a regular basis. So, given the active fault line and the subduction zone that is present, it's only a matter of time before we witness a medium or a high magnitude, high intensity earthquake, which can decimate and flatten entire cities. So, this is a warning for India, and that's why the writer is urging the central government, the states, and the local administration to strictly abide by the National Disaster Management Policy and Plan and implement the building standards immediately. Along with this, we need to improve our preparedness. We need to improve our emergency relief and response mechanisms to deal with such large scale destruction. So, if India implements these measures, then we would be better prepared to at least mitigate and minimize the impact and help in quick recovery of the affected areas. So, based on this topic, you can expect a mains question in GS paper 3. You might even expect a related question in GS paper 1 under geography as the topic is connected. So let's look at the practice question. And as you know, in every session, I make it a point to discuss the first question, provide you the answer writing approach so that you can improve your answer writing skills. So let's read the question and understand how you can write a good answer to ensure that you get maximum marks. Let's read the question first. With earthquake activity intensifying regionally and globally, the government of India must lead a national dialogue to enforce seismic codes rigorously. So it's a very straightforward question. The question is pointing out rising earthquake and seismic activity and what measures should government of India take, especially in the context of enforcing seismic codes. So the question is very specific, very particular. It's focused on building safety, building standards. See, today, engineering, civil engineering, and architectural design has advanced so much that you can not only create buildings which are earthquake proof and resilient, you can even retrofit old buildings as well to make them withstand the impact of earthquakes. For example, if you look at countries like Japan, or even if you look at Taiwan, many of their skyscrapers easily withstand higher magnitude earthquakes because they've all been installed with dampeners, these massive iron balls which are displaced at the top, right, connected to the core columns and beams of the building, that allows the building to sway and be a little flexible, which allows it to absorb the seismic shock. Then also, if you look at how buildings are reinforced and retrofitted. There's a architectural engineering design, which is referred to as ductile detailing. Any civil engineers, architects who are watching, I think they will understand this better. But let's break it down so it becomes easier for others as well. There's also a practice called steel jacketing, where you can take up these methods to increase the ductility of the core columns and beams of the structure so that they are a little flexible to absorb the shock waves and the impact. Buildings usually collapse, right? When the whole structure is very rigid and if it is not designed to slightly absorb the shock waves, it has to be slightly flexible. It has to sway with the shock waves. So, installing dampeners in high rises, implementing ductile detailing and steel jacketing in other buildings to strengthen the columns and the structure, and building a strong foundation. These are essential aspects of ensuring that infrastructure buildings become more earthquake resilient. It may not be 100% earthquake proof, but at least it can minimize the damage. So that is the focus of the question. What measures can be taken in terms of seismic codes focused on building standards? So, how do you approach this question? First, in the introduction, always set the context. Since the question is talking about increasing earthquake activity, you can provide some recent instances that you're aware of. Any recent examples of earthquakes, like the recent earthquake in Myanmar, Thailand, the recent earthquakes India has experienced. So, quote them to highlight the risk which is present, the kind of damage it can cause, and express your view that it is very, very essential to follow the standards and the building codes to minimize the impact of such disasters. So you're setting the context, expressing your view as well. So the evaluator has a clear idea as to what approach you're taking in the answer. So set this right in the introduction itself in, let's say, 4 to 5 lines. Then in the body, discuss India's vulnerability and disaster risk. If possible, draw a rough map of India, highlight the vulnerability profile of India, highlighting the seismic zones, and point out that a large part of India in the Himalayan belt, in northeast India, in the Indo-Gangetic plain, in the Bhuj region, Andaman Nicobar Islands, they are extremely prone to the impact. And point out how these areas are unprepared, especially with regard to implementing the seismic codes and standards. So you're not only highlighting the risk, but you're also detailing the shortcomings and challenges which are present. Then, in the second part of the body, offer your solutions. Provide some recommendations regarding how we can enforce the seismic codes. What kind of standards have to be followed in construction? How can we make our infrastructure more earthquake resilient? So, one paragraph on this. And finally, conclude your answer. The conclusion can be a little generic and forward looking. You can point out that it's always better to be prepared, right, than to be caught unaware. So, point out how important preparedness is with regard to disaster management. You can bring in the concept of disaster management and highlight why it is so important to focus on planning and preparedness in the pre disaster phase. So, this makes for a good structure, a good answer with a logical flow. So, let's see if you guys can make use of this discussion we have had to write an answer, and please post your answers in the comment section as well. Now, let's look at the next article. There is an editorial on page number 6 that focuses on the safety of women, especially at workplace. How women in India have become more vulnerable for sexual harassment and sexual violence, even at the workplace. Recently, we have seen many horrific incidents being reported. I'm sure many of you might be aware of a recent case from Odisha, where in a college, a young student, the girl was facing sexual harassment from her own lecturer. She complained about this to the principal. She raised the issue multiple times with the college management and even reached out to higher authorities all the way up till the chief minister's office. And yet, nobody responded. The college didn't even set up an internal complaints committee, a ICC, which is mandatory according to the Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act of 2013. According to the Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act that was brought out in 2013, it is mandatory for organizations to have an internal complaints committee to receive these complaints of sexual harassment and carry out independent inquiries and later ensure that the guilty are punished according to the law. But this college didn't even bother to constitute the ICC, and it appeared that the principal was almost colluding with this perpetrator. And eventually, this student, who was frustrated, immolated herself and ended up losing her life, committing suicide. So, this is a tragic case where the system has failed the victim of sexual harassment at workplace. There are other horrific cases coming up as well in Karnataka, the Dakshin Kannada region in Mangaluru. A horrific case has been reported where a student has been raped multiple times by her own lecturers, and this case has just come to the light. We have heard about recent cases in West Bengal, in a law college, where a law student was raped by a fellow student. Then the RG car case, the RG car medical college incident that happened few months ago that triggered nationwide protests. So this has become a recurring feature. Every now and then, we express our selective outrage about few rape incidents, like the RG car medical incident, whereas similar outrage is not seen for many other cases which are being reported almost on a daily basis. Now, this is nothing but a complete failure of the system, the legal criminal justice system, the lack of enforcement of laws. It's not that we don't have sufficient laws in place. If you look at sexual harassment at workplace in particular, the Supreme Court of India back in 1997 brought out a very important set of guidelines in the Vishaka case, which is popularly referred to as the Vishaka Guidelines. In the Vishaka case, the Supreme Court dealt with the incident of sexual harassment at workplace, where a government worker was raped while she was on her duty. And following this horrific incident, the Supreme Court's intervention led to the Vishaka guidelines that were brought out. This mandated the government to take immediate steps to ensure that working spaces are protected and systems are put in place at a workplace to protect women and so that women can come out and report such complaints and prevent such harassment from occurring at a workplace. Based on the Vishaka guidelines, finally the government drafted a law and the Indian Parliament enacted the Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act in 2013. This law mandates the establishment of an internal complaints committee comprising of at least a women member. There should be some independent members as well, ensuring that these complaints are heard. Any incident of sexual harassment is immediately taken notice. It also mandates the posh training at places of work for prevention of sexual harassment. So this has been made mandatory, and yet we are seeing repeated incidents happening, and the victims are often left to fend for themselves. So this again brings back the horrific memories of the Nirbhaya gang rape incident, following which we saw a major outrage across the country where people protested against the lack of protection for women. So following the Nirbhaya gang rape incident, which was a landmark event, a lot of reforms were introduced in our criminal justice system. The Justice Verma Committee, which was set up, came out with several strong recommendations to reform the legal and criminal justice system. Major changes were introduced into the Indian Penal Code and the CRPC, which are now reflected in the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. Changes were introduced into the Workplace Act, and the government also took proactive steps to ensure that women feel safer through police reforms, judicial legal reforms. Number of steps were initiated to ensure that we deal effectively with rapes incidents of molestation, and as well as sexual harassment in general. But despite this, these crimes keep on recurring. In fact, the data is quite alarming. If you look at data from the NCRB, the National Crime Records Bureau, the data which is available is of 2022, because the 2023 data is yet to be released by the National Crime Records Bureau. If you look at the data of 2022, based on the crimes that were reported in 2021, almost 4.45 lakh cases were reported where crimes against women had occurred. This is a staggering number. Almost half a million cases were crimes against women. And out of these cases, 31% of them were incidents of abuse and violence, including sexual harassment by family members, by adults and relatives within the family of the victim. This again points towards the lack of safety that exists within the family setup, within the society. 18% of these cases involved crimes against women with the intent to outrage the modesty of women. These are cases that deal with molestation, sexual harassment, etc. 18% of such cases were in this context, where the intent was to outrage the modesty of women. And 7.1% of the cases were rape cases. Now, please understand, these are just the reported incidents. Because, as we know, in most cases, the victims hesitate to come out and report the incidents, either because they are terrified of the consequences, they don't want to deal with the difficulties in our legal system, right? Or there is this stigma and taboo which is attached with any form of sexual violence, where the victim is essentially targeted and labeled as a essential offender, right? Almost the victim is treated like an offender. So these norms, the patriarchal social norms, and the taboo attached with it, and the hesitation of the victim to come out and reach out to the police and the justice system, leads to several cases not being reported. So you can safely assume that the actual number of cases must be much, much higher than this. On a year to year basis, we are seeing 4 to 5% increase in these cases. And it points towards the lack of women's safety. If women are not safe in colleges, in spaces of education, in places of work, and within their family, that is the greatest tragedy for a democratic state. So, this is a very debatable issue. So, please let me know what you think. What you think are the solutions? What else can be done? Because the government has tried several initiatives, from Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao Andolan to various safety initiatives and reforming the laws, making stringent provisions. So, what do you think is the right solution? What should be the way forward to deal with such incidents of sexual violence and sexual harassment? Let me know in the comments and take up this practice question. Sexual violence in workplaces and educational institutions is worrying. Critically analyze. Now, let's look at the next article. We have another important editorial on page number 6 that is focused on India's trade relations with the United States. India and the United States have a very strong trade relationship. The US is one of our largest trading partners. Usually, the United States is amongst the top two trading partners for India. After China, China usually occupies the number one position. Followed by China, it's usually the US. But there have been some years in the past decade where US has been the number one trading partner by overtaking China as well. So clearly, this is one of the most important trading relationships for India, and India enjoys a trade surplus with the United States, meaning we export more than what we import. So this is what has attracted the scrutiny by the Trump administration, as Donald Trump doesn't like others to have a trade surplus. He doesn't like US to have a trade deficit. And he assumes that a trade deficit is automatically a bad thing for the economy. So Donald Trump has threatened India with tariffs, unleashed a trade war as well. Right? In the first presidency, it launched a trade war against India, targeting steel, aluminum exports from India. Right now, the Trump administration has announced up to 26, 27% tariffs. And he's even threatening up to 100% tariffs on certain product lines. As of now, these tariffs have been paused to allow for negotiations to take place so that a mini trade deal can be worked out. And President Trump has even set a deadline for this. This deadline recently expired on the 9th of July. It has been extended by few more weeks. So, in another 2 to 3 weeks, a trade agreement is highly expected between India and the United States. Because officials from both sides, they are rushing to finalize a trade agreement to avoid the imposition of these high tariffs, which could destroy the trade relations between India and US. So, in this backdrop, it is very important to look at the trade data from India. If you look at India's export and import numbers, if you look at the first quarter of this fiscal, of this financial year, there is a positive light for India. We have registered a much lower trade deficit in general, meaning our exports have sustained, imports have reduced slightly, and as a result, India has been able to slightly bring down the trade deficit. Now, this is not just with the United States. With US, we anyways have a trade surplus. The data I'm referring to here, the Q1 data of this fiscal, is a reference to the overall balance of trade on the current account. This refers to the difference between our total exports and imports across all the trade partners. We have been able to sustain our export levels, slightly increase it, and imports have slightly gone down, contributing to a reduced trade deficit. So, this is positive news for India. But, however, if you look at India's exports, the reason why we have been able to sustain our exports and slightly increase our exports is primarily because of two product lines. One would be refined petrochemical products. Today, India has become a major exporter of refined petrochemical products. We are no longer just an importer of petrochemical products. We import the raw material, of course, crude oil and gas. And through its refining capacity, India is turning this into various petrochemical products and exporting this around the world, especially into the European market. So, this accounts for a significant share of our exports in recent months. Then we have the gems and jewelry industry, which is also a significant contributor. And there are other labor intensive sectors like textiles, garments, even pharmaceuticals and furniture and others. But if you look at India's exports, it is always the export of services which is a savior for India. India has always been a service based economy more than a manufacturing led economy. Our manufacturing led exports have largely been flat. We haven't seen any substantial increase, whereas our service led exports have been the front runner. That's one reason why India is able to slightly maintain that balance on its trade deficit and even have a trade surplus with some partners like the United States. Now, this entire balance, macroeconomic balance of India, it rests on one important factor: India's import of cheap Russian oil. In the last 3 years, since Russia came under Western economic sanctions following the Ukraine war, Russia has been selling discounted oil to partners like India, China, and others. And India has been one of the biggest buyers of Russian oil. In fact, in the last 3 years, Russia has become the number one oil supplier to India. Previously, it was Iraq, which was the number one oil supplier to India, followed by Saudi Arabia. Now, Russia has beaten both Saudi and Iraq and has emerged as the number one oil supplier to India. And recently, India has even overtaken China as the biggest buyer of Russian oil. India has overtaken China as well to become the number one buyer of Russian oil. So, if you take all our oil imports into account, nearly 37% of our oil supply is coming from Russia. Now, this could be dangerous as we are negotiating a trade agreement with the US. Why? Because the Trump administration is threatening secondary sanctions on countries that are continuing to trade with Russia. And since India is one of the biggest buyers of Russian oil, we have even overtaken China. We are essentially funding the Russian war in Ukraine. And India is even profiting from this war as we are buying cheap discounted oil, turning it into refined petrochemical products and exporting it at a premium price back into the European market. That's the irony as well. Europeans who didn't want Russian oil, who blockaded Russian oil after the start of the war, they're essentially buying those refined products from India through a different route and paying a higher price for it. That's one reason why some European countries are not happy with India and India's position on the Ukraine war. See, India maintains its independent, neutral foreign policy, right? We look after our own interests. Given our energy security requirements, if there is cheaper, reliable supply of oil available, we will go and buy it, no matter what the consequences. Because we are not here to worry about American concerns or European concerns. The war in Ukraine is not essentially a conflict that directly affects India. It's something that India should not get directly involved in. And more importantly, Russia has been a trusted all weather friend. So India has done the right thing by siding with Russia subtly while pushing for the end of the conflict. But in the interim, the opportunity that has arisen with cheaper Russian oil available, India has fully utilized this opportunity. We have become the biggest lifters of Russian oil, turning it into various refined petrochemical products. So today, India is becoming a lead exporter of refined petrochemical products. But however, there is a risk present here. When you become extremely dependent on one source, on one country to supply a key resource, there is a bigger risk of a negative consequence. Because if US levies secondary sanctions on India or uses this as a leverage to strike a harder bargain in the trade agreement, then that could be detrimental to India's trade and economic interests. Either the US will levy secondary sanctions, which could hurt India's oil imports from Russia, and at the last minute, we will have to scramble to look for other sources of supply. So this could threaten our energy security. Or most likely, US will use this as a leverage, as a bargaining point. They will blackmail India during the talks with secondary sanctions for importing Russian oil, and they will try to seek concessions for American products and American companies to exploit the Indian market. After all, Trump is a businessman, right? He looks after his own personal business interests and as well as the interests of the American corporate world. So they might very well use this as a bargaining chip against India, threaten India with secondary sanctions to seek wider concessions in other sectors, including agriculture, which could be detrimental for our domestic producers. So any such concessions, if they are made in the agreement, will hurt our farmers, our MSME industry. So that is why the editorial says that this is a lesson for India. We need to diversify our oil sources. Though Russian oil is cheaper, can't depend just on one source. We need to diversify the oil sources, ensure that we don't depend just on one supply source. And at the same time, we have to strengthen our manufacturing sector. You can't always depend on service led exports. Your export of goods from the manufacturing industry should increase. And for that, the MSME sector has to contribute. So that is the point the editorial is trying to highlight. Now, let's look at another interesting and important article on page number 9, which helps us understand a very important keyword which is often used in international relations. This article is focused on the word genocide, examining the origin of the word, what does it mean, and what are the consequences of this horrific crime that someone can commit against humanity in general. The term genocide is of a more recent origin. Humanity didn't even have a word for such a horrific crime until recently. We saw such a horrific act being committed during the Second World War when the Nazis carried out the brutal Holocaust against the Jews, where millions of Jews were exterminated. So it was a Jewish lawyer from Poland who coined the term genocide. His name is Raphael Lemkin. Please make a note because his contribution to international law with regard to conflicts is extremely crucial and it has relevance even today. Today, countries like Israel stand accused of committing a genocide against Palestinians. It's in that context that the article is exploring the concept of a genocide. What is a genocide? Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish lawyer from Poland, he had seen the horrors of World War One, where Armenians were slaughtered in mass numbers by the then Ottoman Empire. 1 million plus Armenians were slaughtered during World War One by the Ottomans, and there were no consequences. Those responsible, they were never held accountable. And Raphael Lemkin, who was at that point during World War One just a young teenager, he was shocked by the fact that the global community was not doing anything, that there was no international system, no accountability to punish the perpetrators of this mass violence, which was so horrific that there was no term that was even available for that. So when he saw this repeating during 1930s and 1940s during the course of the Second World War, where Jews were being exterminated by Nazi Germany, Raphael Lemkin coined the term genocide. So what does it mean? Genocide is drawn from two words. It's drawn from the word genus, a Greek word, which refers to a race or a tribe or a certain ethnic group. And the term side, the syllable side, is a Latin word for killing. So now I think the meaning of genocide becomes apparent. Killing on the lines of race, ethnicity, religion. When such mass killings are carried out, which are enabled by the state, which is perpetrated by the state, where an attempt is made with the intent to destroy an entire group of people. So this extermination could be on the basis of someone's nationality or someone's religion or ethnicity or race. On these grounds, if mass killings are carried out, if a clear attempt is made to physically destroy the group of people, completely to eliminate them altogether from the face of the earth, such a horrific, unimaginable act of cruelty is labeled as genocide. This terminology entered international law as well when the Genocide Convention was adopted in 1948. That's why Raphael Lemkin had a very big contribution for coining the term genocide, for codifying this into international law, which later took the form of Genocide Convention of 1948. The Genocide Convention refers to specific conditions where mass killings can be labeled as an act of genocide. For example, as I said, if there is a deliberate intent to destroy an entire group of people on the lines of nationality, ethnicity, race, religion, such an act accounts to be labeled as a genocide. There are other provisions as well. For example, if an attempt is made to deliberately cut off essentials for a community in order to ensure they don't survive, if an attempt is made to cut off food, water, and other essential supplies to starve the people to death, or if a deliberate attempt is made to not provide medical aid and support to an entire group of people in a conflict so that all of them will perish, even such an attempt is labeled as a genocide. Or even an attempt to prevent the birth of children in a specific community, to prevent the next generation from being born, or transferring the children deliberately to erase of that community entirely. These acts are labeled as acts of genocide. Now, the problem is how exactly do you qualify a certain event as an act of genocide? Now, if you look at what's happening in Gaza, there are many countries, legal experts who argue that Israel is indeed committing a genocide. There are others who defend Israel as well, and Israel itself rejects these charges. But if you look at the acts of violence, the disproportionate use of force, the attempt to target Palestinian civilians, and the act of killing children without thinking twice, this is something that fits the definition of an act of genocide. The act of cutting off essential supplies from medical aid to food and water, which Israel has done. So that is where, for example, if you look at the UN Special Rapporteur who deals with Palestinians, see, she recently brought up this issue again, alleging that Israel is indeed committing a genocide and the international community is not acting against it. The United States has even sanctioned the UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, for raising her voice and pointing out that what's happening in Gaza is indeed a genocide. So, at the International Criminal Court, South Africa and others have filed a case as well under the provisions of the Rome Statute and the Genocide Convention, alleging that Israel is committing a genocide against Palestinians. So, the writer of this article is pointing out that such incidents have recurred repeatedly throughout human history. You look at the Rwandan genocide in 1994. You look at the killing of Bosnian Muslims in 1995, and the list goes on. Right? Throughout history, there are such incidents where attempts have been made to wipe out an entire group of people on these lines. But yet, the international community has failed to put in place checks and balances. The article actually brings up a very, very important thought, a very deep and profound thought. Should humans be extremely evil to commit such an act of genocide? Generally, you associate such brutal killings with extremely evil people, right? But studies based on Nazi Germany shows that most of the Nazi officers who willingly took part in the killings of the Jews and other minorities who were targeted, they didn't oppose even 1 second. They never questioned the decision of the leadership. They went ahead with the orders blindly. It's not that all of them were essentially evil people. They basically ended up giving up their individual thinking, looking after their own interests, and they submitted themselves to the propaganda and the fascist dictatorship that had been built under Adolf Hitler. The article refers to a historian who interviewed Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust. She writes, that historian writes, based on her interview with Adolf Eichmann, that when you meet this individual, this Nazi officer, you don't think that he's an evil person. He doesn't come across as an evil person. But he ended up essentially planning and orchestrating one of the biggest mass killings in history. So his defense was not thinking critically. He was not thinking for himself. He was not thinking about the consequences. He was just worried about his own career opportunities. He was just looking to please his superiors, blindly following the orders. And this is what Nazi Germany had done very, very effectively through propaganda and through strict, rigid enforcement where orders had to be followed. So even the seemingly good people might end up participating in these acts of genocide, even without their own realization as well. That is the reason why it is very, very important to promote critical thought. And that is a key point being raised by this article. To prevent such brutal atrocities, horrific crimes, what you need is critical thinking for people to think for their own, for themselves, to understand what is right and wrong. Nothing justifies killing innocent children. There is absolutely nothing, no act can justify the killing of children. This is something which has been looked down upon since ancient times. And Israel is blatantly killing hundreds of children every day without consequences. This is not just about targeting Israel or blaming everything on Israel. This is about what is right or what is wrong. There have been such horrific incidents in the past. The global community more or less accepted these killings. Very little consequences have been faced by the perpetrators. Even if you look at the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi soldiers and officers were tried for the genocide they carried out, they were tried on the grounds of war crimes and crimes against humanity, but they were never held accountable for the crimes they committed against their own citizens. When they targeted German Jewish citizens, they were never held accountable for those crimes. In fact, when this idea was pushed at the Nuremberg trials, that Nazi Germany officers should be punished separately for committing crimes on their own citizens, United States and Russia supported the Nazi officers because they themselves didn't want this to be codified into international law. Because as you know, in Soviet Union, it was regular practice to target different groups, if not on religious or ethnic lines, definitely on political lines and social lines. There was regular targeting that was going on of minorities. Same with the United States and Jim Crow's racial segregation, where the blacks and minorities were targeted. The United States didn't want to be held accountable for these horrific crimes against its own population. So these global powers essentially gave up the opportunity which was available at that point to codify this into international law, to ensure such incidents do not recur, and if at all it happens, ensure that the perpetrators are held guilty and punished. So international legal system is as weak as possible because there have been no genuine attempts to build an accountable system. So this is what we take away from this important article. Next, on page 5, let's look at this article that is related to India's energy sector. There is a very, very big development which you have to make a note of. India has achieved a very big milestone. 50% of our installed power capacity is today coming from renewable energy. Clean renewable energy today accounts for 50% of our installed power capacity. And this is a very, very big achievement for India. So, clean sources like solar, wind, biomass, hydropower, and nuclear, they account for nearly 484 gigawatts of installed power capacity in the country today. In the last decade, especially, India has seen very significant progress. In 2014, when the Modi government took over, this number was at 30%. The installed power capacity, the clean energy that was coming from installed power capacity of India was around 30%. It has jumped to 50% in a span of just 10 years, which means we have achieved one of our climate targets. As per the Paris Agreement, under the Climate Change Convention, under India's INDCs, the intended nationally determined contributions, one of the goals that India had set for itself was to have 50% of energy coming from clean renewable sources. And the deadline was 2030. By 2030, the goal was to ensure at least 500 gigawatts, which is up to 50% of our installed power capacity, to be coming from clean renewable energy sources. So we have met the target 5 years before the deadline. India has already achieved this target 5 years before the deadline. So this is indeed a significant milestone. But however, you need to understand that there is still a major challenge which is present. Because see, installed power capacity is not what eventually matters. What matters is how much power is actually available for utilization. Installed power capacity is simply on paper. It's largely theoretical, right? Just because you have set up more solar plants, nuclear plants, and other sources of energy doesn't mean all the power can be generated and it can be utilized in real time. So there's something called CUF, capacity utilization factor. This is a very important indicator. The capacity utilization factor tells you how much of that installed capacity can actually be used to produce electricity, which can be utilized in the economy. So, installed power capacity is one parameter. Installed power capacity is never available in real life, it's just a theoretical number. So, how much of this can be used to actually produce the electricity and how much of it can be utilized depends on capacity utilization factor. Now, with regard to solar energy, it depends on the availability of sunlight and the daylight conditions. It depends on atmospheric, climatic factors. It also depends on battery storage, whether you have sufficient storage capabilities to store the energy, because clean energy like solar and wind, they are intermittent. They are not continuous sources of energy. You can't keep on producing solar and wind energy 24/7, right? There will be a break. It depends on all these factors. And more importantly, on the storage capacity. How efficiently can you store the power being generated, and transmit and distribute this so that it can be actually utilized. So if you account for all these losses and factor in the capacity utilization, for solar energy, it is just 20%. Out of the total installed capacity, just maybe around 20% will be utilized. For wind energy, this is around roughly 25%. So, with regard to these forms of new clean energy, the utilization factor is very, very less. So, if you account for utilization factor and then look at India's numbers, today our share of clean energy in our electricity generation is at 30%, slightly below 30%. So installed power capacity is around 50%, but what electricity we are generating actually and utilizing it from clean sources, it is just below 30%. So this is the number that should be kept in mind as well. Now, if you look at thermal power plants, coal-based power plants, they account for most of the electricity production and consumption in our country, right? In case of coal, utilization is 80%, depending on the quality of the coal. It could be around 60% as well if the coal and the production and distribution lines are not efficient, but it can go up as high as 80%. Even nuclear energy has a utilization factor of 80%, meaning they are much more efficient in generating consistent power, right? You don't need to store the energy generated through coal and nuclear sources. You can directly supply and consume them. But in case of solar and wind, utilization becomes heavily dependent on your storage capability. You need to store that electricity and then transmit and distribute. So this is something that India should keep in mind as we strive towards adoption of clean renewable energy. The writers are suggesting that India should consider differential pricing depending on peak hour usage. This can bring in more revenue, which can be utilized for investments in battery storage to improve the utilization capacity. Now, if you remember, when landline telephones were introduced many years ago, there was a differential pricing mechanism. If you place a call during daytime, during peak hours, the prices were different. You have to pay more prices. But if you call late in the night, the cost would be lower, right? Some of you might remember your family members would often call late in the night because the cost was lower. There was differential pricing. This is called distribution of load. Now, in terms of electricity and power consumption, the peak consumption obviously happens in the evening, right? And through the night. So there can be a differential pricing structure based on demand so that the additional revenue generated could be channeled towards more battery storage to improve the utilization of the capacity which has been installed. So this is how India can reap the full benefits of the installed power capacity. But still, it is a big milestone. And going forward, we should focus on improving the utilization of this installed power capacity. Next, on page 13, we have an article related to economy. The government is cracking down on the practice of dumping and unexpected import surges. So, what is dumping and why sudden import surge is a threat for the Indian economy and what action is being taken? That's what we need to understand. Dumping is a practice where a country or a company which is exporting goods to another country tries to sell this product at a price lower than its domestic sale price. So, when this is done in large numbers, you will see a flood of cheap imports coming from another country, and this could destroy your domestic manufacturers. Now, let's say, for example, let's say we take a mobile phone produced in China. China is a manufacturing powerhouse. It can produce at scale, right? It can leverage the low cost of labor and raw materials, the subsidies given by the government, and Chinese electronic companies can produce cheaper phones compared to rest of the world. Now, let's hypothetically assume this mobile phone maybe is being sold in the Chinese market at $100. Now, just to tap the Indian market and to completely flood the Indian market, to destroy the domestic companies in India, Chinese exporters and Chinese companies, they might try to undersell the product because they have a higher profit margin. right? Given the cost of production is very low, they can play with the profit margin. They can try to push those mobile phones on India at just, let's say, $80, which is lower than the selling price in the domestic market in China. So when this happens on a large scale, and if it starts hurting our domestic producers, right? Because an Indian mobile phone manufacturer maybe will never be able to produce a phone even at $100. So how will they even compete with a phone which is priced at $80? There's no way they can compete. They'll be driven out of competition. They'll have to shut the factory. So when such a threat comes up, it qualifies to be treated as an unfair pricing strategy under the WTO rules. See, dumping per se is not illegal as per WTO. But if it hurts your domestic economy, if a country can establish that there is a deliberate attempt to hurt the domestic producers, to drive them out of competition, if this can be established, then a country can invoke the powers under WTO to impose anti dumping duties. So in India, this power lies with the Ministry of Commerce, the Directorate General of Foreign Trade, the DGFT, looks out for such practices of dumping. It keeps on conducting regular audits and checks to see if any products are being dumped on the Indian market, which can hurt our domestic producers. It also keeps track of any sudden surge in imports with a wrong intention. Recently, investigation by the DGFT has revealed that gold was being discreetly brought into the country through a illegal method. What the importers were doing was they were importing alloys of gold like palladium, rhodium, iridium. They do contain a small percentage of gold, and they actually have duty free access into the Indian market. Zero taxes are placed on it. But I'm sure you know, taxes on the import duties on gold is much higher. So various jewelers, manufacturers of jewelry in India, they were tying up with certain importers, importing these gold alloys with duty free benefit, and then they can separate the gold and use it for the jewelry industry. This would significantly reduce the cost of the raw material. This was an illegal practice which was going on, a misuse of the system which was present. So there was a sudden surge in import of these gold alloys. That's why the DGFT flagged the sudden surge, and immediate rectification has been taken up by the Directorate General of Trade Remedies, which is also under the Commerce Ministry. The Directorate General of Trade Remedies has the authority to impose such import duties and anti dumping duties to block the entry of these products. Now, let's look at the prelim section and wrap up the discussion today. We have 4 articles. Let's take a quick look. The Union Cabinet has approved a very, very important scheme in the field of agriculture. Around 36 existing schemes have been merged and subsumed into one mega program. It's called Pradhan Mantri Dhan-Dhaanya Krishi Yojana. Please make a note. This mega agriculture program or scheme was promised by the Modi government in this year's union budget. 24,000 crores has been allocated to this program for the next 6 years. And under this scheme, the central government will closely work with state governments and even the private sector to promote agriculture in the most weakest districts of the country. The districts which will receive the benefits of this program, they will be identified on the basis of low productivity. If let's say a certain district has very low agricultural productivity, or let's say if a district has very low cropping intensity, or if a district has very low credit disbursement, which means farmers are not taking enough loans from the banking and financial institutions. So, based on these parameters, these indicators, the government is going to select some of the weakest districts in the country with regard to agriculture. So, this is modeled on the aspirational districts program, which was implemented. If you remember, under aspirational districts program as well, the most backward districts were chosen and selected, especially with greater focus on left wing extremism affected districts. right? Those districts which were lagging behind in infrastructure, in overall development, they were chosen, and special funds were given, special attention was given to these districts to improve the developmental indicators. So, based on the similar model, the most weakest districts in agriculture are being identified under this program, which have low productivity, low cropping intensity, low credit disbursement. And through these funds, the government is going to invest in improving agricultural productivity. The government will encourage the farmers to focus on crop diversification to increase farmers' income. The government will also focus on the health of the soil, water management, and as well as the back end logistics in the agricultural supply chain to create adequate warehousing facilities, cold storage facilities, which can help in minimizing post harvest losses. So, across the entire life cycle of agriculture, right from sowing a crop to its harvest and post harvest management, across the entire life cycle, support would be provided by the government in these chosen districts. So, this is a very ambitious scheme that has been launched by the government of India, the Pradhan Mantri Dhan-Dhaanya Krishi Yojana, which has subsumed 36 existing programs. Next, on page number 8, there's an article referring to a tribal community in Gujarat. It's a very interesting story. This helps you learn something about Indian society, the tribal communities and customs in the country. A certain tribal community in Gujarat, in northern part of Gujarat, which is a tribal belt, it had been exiled for 12 years. And now this community has returned. They've come back to the village and now they are being rehabilitated. So, how come an entire community was exiled and thrown out of their village? They lost their homes and land. And now, why are they coming back? See, this tribal community in question is known as the Kodarvi tribe, a recognized scheduled tribe. So, they were at conflict with a rival tribal group called the Dabi tribe. Around 12 years ago, there was an incident where a murder was committed. A member of the Dabi tribe was killed by a member of the Kodarvi tribe. This killing led to the invocation of a tribal custom which is prevalent in northern Gujarat amongst the tribal communities here. This custom is known as Chada Chado Taru. Chado Taru is a tribal custom of seeking vengeance, seeking revenge for such crimes which are committed, where not only the perpetrator is punished, but the entire community will be exiled and banished as a form of punishment. So it's a very traditional tribal custom which is often practiced in indigenous tribal societies. So this custom, known as Chado Taru, essentially would lead to the affected community seeking justice by exiling and banishing the entire community which has committed this crime or offense against them. So, because of this murder which happened, the whole community had been driven out and exiled. They lost their homes and land. And now, after completing the exile period, they're coming back and returning. And the district administration, the police, they are facilitating this process. They are helping in the rehabilitation and resettlement of this tribal community. So, it's a very interesting aspect of Indian society, which can be relevant under social issues. Next, the United States is building a massive military facility in Philippines. The US is setting up a repair and maintenance facility at two locations at the strategic Palwan Island, which belongs to Philippines. So there are two locations which are in news. Please make a note of them. It can be important for places in news questions. At Oyster Bay and Quezon City. At these two locations, the US Navy will be setting up a massive repair and maintenance facility, almost like a naval base, to support the Philippines Navy, which is actively deployed here in the South China Sea. So you need to see this in the context of the South China Sea dispute. China Philippines have an active dispute going on over the Spratly group of islands, which is also contested by Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam. Then China Philippines are also facing a dispute over Scarborough Shoal and as well as the first and second Thomas Shoal. Recently, China has even captured a reef. The Sandy Cay Reef has been captured by China, which belongs to Philippines. There are certain reefs like Mischief Reef, which is also disputed. And the Chinese Navy and Coast Guard have been very aggressive in these waters. They are violating the established international rules. China has been constantly breaking the rules based order under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it is disrupting freedom of navigation. The Chinese Navy and Coast Guard are known to disrupt the movement of vessels. They have threatened the vessels of Philippines and even used aggressive action against the vessels from Philippines, trying to sink them. So there is a constant face-off taking place between China and Philippines, and the United States, which is a very close ally of Philippines, is directly involved in this standoff. The US not only has a major military base in Philippines, now it is setting up two repair and maintenance facilities to support the Philippines Navy. So that's the reason why this development becomes relevant. So please note down the location of the Palawan Island Group. It's part of Philippines, and at two locations at Oyster Bay and Quezon City, these repair and maintenance facilities will come up. So this will definitely antagonize China. Now, coming to the last article for today, Israel has unleashed a new series of attacks aimed at Syria. Yesterday, Syria's capital, Damascus, suffered heavy bombing through these airstrikes that were carried out by the Israeli Air Force and the defense forces. Israeli fighter jets, they launched precision strikes, and missiles were also fired to target the defense ministry and vital government buildings and important strategic installations. And the reason why Israel has attacked Syria is because of the ongoing violence in Syria against a minority community called the Druze community. The Druze are an ethno religious minority found in this region, and of late, they have been the victims of targeted sectarian violence. I'm sure you know that recently Syria's President Bashar al Assad was toppled, Assad's regime was thrown out, and power has been captured by radical groups such as the Hayat Tahrir al Sham, which is essentially a Sunni radical jihadist outfit. And its leader, al Julani, has now transformed himself into the Syrian president under the name Ahmad al Shara. He has even met with US President Donald Trump and some of the regional leaders as well. And under Ahmad al Shara and these radical forces, Syria is looking to stabilize the country and bring some sense of balance back in Syria. But ever since these radical forces took over the country, there have been targeted attacks against various minorities. The Kurd community is under attack, and similarly, the Druze, which represents a ethno-religious minority, has been targeted. In last few days, large-scale violence has broken out. Hundreds of members of the Druze community have been killed, including women and children. So Israel has said it has acted in defense of the Druze minority. To protect the Druze minority, it has targeted Syrian government facilities and the militias and the terror groups that were unleashing violence against the Druze minorities. So, who are the Druze minorities? Why is Israel protecting them? That is what you need to understand. The Druze are an Arab speaking ethno religious minority. They are an offshoot of Shia Islam, but they are very loyal to Israel. That's the reason why Israel is connected with the Druze community. The Druze minority can be found across the Levant region. If you see here in the map, the Druze minorities are found in Syria, in Lebanon, in Israel, and they are mainly concentrated here in the Golan Heights, which is an illegally occupied territory by Israel. During the 1967 Six-Day War, Golan Heights until then was with Syria. It was Syrian territory. that Israel has illegally occupied. And it is internationally recognized as a illegally occupied territory, even by the United Nations, even by India, US. All countries recognize Golan Heights as a illegally occupied territory by Israel. So the Druze who are in minority here, they are an offshoot of Shia Islam, a religious minority essentially. And historically, they have been loyal to the Jewish community, and now they're loyal to the Israeli state. They're even part of the Israeli defense forces. That's the reason why Israel has said it is acting in defense of this minority community as they are being targeted, especially in the city of Suveda. Large scale sectarian violence has broken out here, where minorities are being slaughtered by the radical forces. So that is the excuse that Israel is giving for these targeted strikes on Damascus, where the attacks have mainly been carried out against government facilities, the troops, and the terror and militias which are operating in the country. So this completes my detailed analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. I hope you guys have understood all the topics, and I hope you guys like the discussion as well. So let me know what you think in the comments, and if you benefited, please press the like button. That is it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Take care.